There are men in the historical record of rural Appalachia who exist in the documents only partially, a name in a land record, a line in a census, a single reference in a neighbor's letter or a merchant's account book. Most of the time, this partial existence means nothing in particular. People lived and died in remote places without leaving much behind, and the thinness of the record is simply the thinness of the record. But occasionally, the partial existence in the official documents is partial for a different reason. Occasionally, a man is thin in the record because the people around him made a collective decision over time to put as little of him on paper as possible, to not write his name where they could avoid it, to leave him in the margins because putting him at the center of anything felt like an invitation. Elias Combs of Letcher County, Kentucky was that kind of man. He appears in the official record of Letcher County between 1874 and 1901 in a total of 7 documents: a land deed from 1874, 2 tax assessment records, a notation in a circuit court log referencing a property dispute that was settled before any formal proceeding, a single line in a merchant's ledger, and 2 entries in the records of the Letcher County Coroner's Office, one from 1889 and one from 1901, the second of which pertains to Elias Combs himself. 7 documents in 27 years for a man who, by the accounts of the people who knew him, was present and active and impossible to ignore. The thinness of the record is its own kind of statement. Before we go further, drop your location in the comments and tell me what time it is where you are, because what those 7 documents contain, and what the private accounts of Letcher County residents fill in around them, is one of the darkest portraits of a man I have found in the documentary record of this region, and the Smokehouse is where it ends. Letcher County, Kentucky in the 1870s and 1880s was headwaters country, the headwaters of the North Fork of the Kentucky River, deep in the Cumberland Mountains, in terrain that was as remote as anywhere in the eastern coalfields before the railroads arrived. The railroad reached Letcher County in the late 1910s, long after the events recorded here. In Elias Combs's time, the county was accessible primarily by river and by ridge trail, and the communities scattered through its hollows and along its creek drainages existed in a degree of practical isolation that is difficult to convey to a modern reader. The nearest county seat, Whitesburg, was a day's travel from the outer hollows on a good day and unreachable in hard winter. The law was thin and stretched and slow. The terrain kept its own counsel. Elias Combs was born, by his own later account, sometime in the early 1840s, which would have made him in his early 30s, when he took possession of the property that would define the rest of his life. The property was a 38-acre parcel at the end of a narrow drainage hollow on the western slope of Pine Mountain, a location chosen, it appeared, for its remoteness above all other considerations. There was no road to the property. There was a creek drainage that could be followed on foot. There was a ridge trail that crossed above it at a distance. The property had a house, a barn, a smokehouse, and a set of trap lines that extended into the surrounding timber in a network that neighbors, on the rare occasions they had reason to venture near, described as more extensive than any single trapper's operation they had seen. Combs was a trapper by occupation, and by inclination he trapped and sold fur. He sold smoked game meat to anyone willing to make the trip to his property to buy it, and occasionally to the merchant in Whitesburg, whose ledger contains the single line referencing him. He had no wife and no children that the record accounts for. He had, by the time anyone in the county began paying systematic attention to him, a reputation that had developed over years through the accumulation of small observations that nobody had initially connected to each other. He was not a man who involved himself in community life. He was not a man who attended church or participated in the informal mutual aid arrangements that sustained most families in the outer hollows. He was a man who the community was aware of and preferred, without ever quite articulating the preference, to be aware of from a distance. The first observation was about the trap lines. A man named Hiram Sexton, who ran his own trap lines on the northern side of Pine Mountain and whose territory occasionally overlapped with the outer edge of Combs's operation, noted in a letter written to his son in 1892, a letter preserved in the Sexton family papers and donated to the Letcher County Historical Society in 1974, that Combs's trap lines were set differently from any lines Sexton had seen in 30 years of trapping. He wrote that the sets were larger than anything required for the game animals of the region. He wrote that the anchoring was heavier than anything an animal was likely to require. He wrote that he had found on 2 occasions sets that were positioned in ways inconsistent with animal behavior, but consistent with a man walking a trail. He wrote that he had not said anything to anyone about this because he was not certain of his interpretation and because Elias Combs was not a man whose attention he wished to attract. This final observation, that Combs was not a man whose attention you wished to attract, appears in every account from every person who had any contact with him during this period. a woman named Sadie Mullins, who lived 4 miles from the Combs property and whose husband had purchased smoked meat from Combs on several occasions in the 1880s, described him in a statement given to Letcher County authorities in 1901 as a man who made her feel, when he looked at her, that he was calculating something. She said the calculation was not hostile in any obvious sense. She said it was more the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to solve, and that being looked at that way as a problem was an experience she found impossible to become accustomed to, no matter how many times she encountered it. Her husband stopped buying from Combs after 1887. He gave no reason that Sadie Mullins could recall. He simply stopped going and did not discuss it. The 1889 entry in the Letcher County Coroner's records is the first official acknowledgement that anything connected to Elias Combs warranted formal attention. It pertains to the death of a man named Cecil Ware, a traveling fur buyer who made periodic circuits through the eastern Kentucky counties, purchasing pelts from trappers and selling them to dealers in Lexington. Ware had been known in Letcher County for several years. His route brought him through Whitesburg twice annually. In the spring of 1888, his route brought him to Elias Combs's property for the first and last time. Cecil Ware did not complete his 1888 circuit. He was reported missing by his business partners in Lexington when he failed to return and failed to send correspondence for a period of 3 months. An inquiry was made to Letcher County. The county sheriff at that time, a man named Augustus Kraft, undertook a limited investigation. He located individuals who had seen Ware in Whitesburg in the spring of 1888. He located, through the merchant's ledger, a notation that indicated Ware had asked about purchasing from Combs. He rode out to the Combs property in the summer of 1888 and spoke with Elias Combs directly. Combs confirmed that Ware had visited. He said Ware had purchased a quantity of pelts and departed. He was calm and cooperative and showed Sheriff Kraft whatever he asked to see: the barn, the smokehouse, the outbuildings. Kraft noted in his report, a report that exists only as a handwritten notation in the Letcher County Circuit Court log, that nothing on the property gave him cause for formal action. He noted that Combs had a quantity of smoked meat in the smokehouse that he described as larger than he would have expected, but that this was not by itself actionable. Cecil Ware was never found. The coroner's entry from 1889 records an inquest finding of death by unknown cause in the course of travel. It was the standard finding for a man who had disappeared in that terrain and could not be located. It closed the matter officially. It did not close it in the minds of the people who knew the circuit Ware had been traveling. Between 1889 and 1901, 3 other individuals disappeared in circumstances that placed them, at some point in their last known movements, in proximity to the western slope of Pine Mountain and the hollow where Elias Combs operated. None of these disappearances were formally connected to each other or to Combs during this period. 2 were recorded as probable accidental deaths in difficult terrain. One, a young man named Thomas Bates, 19 years old, who had gone to the Combs property in the autumn of 1896 seeking seasonal trapping work, was recorded as missing, presumed to have relocated. His family in Whitesburg disputed this assessment for years. His mother, a woman named Ruth Bates, wrote 4 letters to the Letcher County Sheriff's Office between 1896 and 1900, insisting that her son had not relocated and demanding that someone return to the Combs property with more thorough intent than Sheriff Kraft had brought in 1888. The letters are preserved in the Letcher County Courthouse records. Each one received a reply acknowledging her concern. None of them resulted in action. It was the autumn of 1901 that changed everything, and the instrument of change was not a sheriff and not a formal investigation. It was a fire. The smokehouse on the Combs property caught fire in October of 1901 under circumstances that were never conclusively explained. Combs was alive when the fire started and claimed, in the brief period before he became unable to speak, that it had begun accidentally. A man named Porter Bates, a cousin of the missing Thomas Bates, who had been watching the Combs property at intervals for years out of a private conviction that his cousin's disappearance was connected to it, saw the smoke from the ridge trail and went down into the hollow. He was the first person to reach the property. He found the smokehouse burning and Elias Combs nearby, severely burned, having apparently attempted to prevent or contain the fire and failed. Combs died of his burns within a day and a half. Porter Bates also found what the fire exposed before the structure collapsed. His statement to the Letcher County coroner, given 3 days after the fire and preserved in the coroner's records as the second of the 2 Combs entries, is 14 pages long. He wrote it himself over the course of 2 sittings because he said the act of writing it was the only way he could make himself organize what he had seen into a form that could be communicated to another person. The statement is precise, methodical, and written in the voice of a man who has decided that clarity is the only gift he can give the record, regardless of what clarity costs him. He described the interior of the smokehouse as the outer walls burned away. He described what was hanging from the rafters and what was stored on the shelving along the walls and what was in the containers on the floor. He described identifying, among the material in the smokehouse, items that could not belong to a man who lived alone: personal effects, clothing, tools, in quantities and variety that corresponded to more individuals than any single man's household could account for. He described, in the section of the statement that the coroner later told him had been the most difficult to read, identifying an item that he recognized as belonging specifically to Thomas Bates. He described the item, its condition, and where in the smokehouse he had found it. He did not describe in the statement what else was in the containers on the floor. He wrote, at the point in the narrative where the containers appeared, a single sentence, "I will not set down what was in the barrels. I have told the coroner by word of mouth, and that will serve." The coroner's notation attached to Bates's statement records that he had received the verbal account and that it was consistent with the physical evidence recovered from the site following the fire. The notation does not describe the physical evidence. It records the coroner's finding that the remains of multiple individuals were present on the property, that the number could not be precisely established given the condition of the evidence, and that Elias Combs, deceased, was the sole occupant of the property and the only individual with access to the smokehouse. The legal proceedings that followed were limited by the fact that the primary subject was dead and could not be charged. The Letcher County Circuit Court received the coroner's report and opened an inquiry. The inquiry established, to the court's satisfaction, that at least 4 individuals whose disappearances had been recorded in the county over the preceding 12 years had died on the Combs property. The court's finding was that Elias Combs had been responsible for those deaths. The finding was entered in the record. No family received any formal restitution because there was no mechanism in Letcher County in 1901 for such restitution, and no one living against whom a civil action could be brought. The property reverted to the county. The court's record notes that the county declined to auction the parcel and that it was designated as county land unimproved, not for sale. Nobody has built on that hollow since. The thing that most of the official documentation does not address directly, because official documentation is not designed to address it, is the question of the meat. The smoked meat that Combs sold to neighbors, that the merchant in Whitesburg listed in his ledger as purchased and resold, that Sadie Mullins's husband had bought and presumably eaten over the course of several years before he stopped going to the property in 1887. The court's inquiry touched on this question obliquely. It did not answer it directly. The coroner's verbal account, the account that Porter Bates said he gave by word of mouth and that was not written down, apparently addressed it. The coroner, a man named Dr. Lester Frazier, resigned from the position 3 months after the inquiry closed. He gave no public reason. He moved to Harlan County and did not discuss the Combs case in any written or recorded form for the rest of his life. The merchant in Whitesburg, whose ledger showed purchases from Combs, closed his shop in 1902. The closure was attributed at the time to economic circumstance. His son, in a letter written decades later, and discovered in a private collection that was donated to the University of Kentucky's Special Collections in 1989, wrote that his father had never eaten smoked meat again after 1901 and had spent the rest of his life not talking about the reason. Today, the hollow on the western slope of Pine Mountain where Elias Combs operated for nearly 30 years shows no trace of any structure. The land has been county-held since 1901 and has never been developed. Pine Mountain itself is now largely within the boundaries of the Pine Mountain State Scenic Trail Corridor, but the specific drainage where the Combs property sat is not crossed by any designated trail. A researcher from Eastern Kentucky University who attempted to locate the site in 2008 using the property deed description from 1874 reported in her research notes that she found the drainage, but that the site itself, if she had correctly identified it, was indistinguishable from the surrounding timber. She noted that the hollow had a quality of quiet she found difficult to describe. She noted she did not stay long. There are questions this case does not answer. Whether the people who ate what Elias Combs sold them knew or suspected what they were eating, whether Sadie Mullins's husband stopped going to the property because he had begun to suspect, or because he had always suspected and simply reached a point where he could not continue, whether the sheriff who visited in 1888 truly saw nothing, or whether he saw something and made a decision that the county was better served by his silence. These questions live in the space the official record refuses to occupy. Was Elias Combs a man who understood exactly what he was doing and did it with intention across 3 decades? Or is there a version of this story in which isolation and the particular logic of survival in a remote hollow produced something in him that he himself did not fully understand until it was the only thing left of him? Drop that in the comments. I have read this record more than once, and I am still not certain which answer is worse. If these are the cases that pull you into the darkest parts of what this landscape produced, the ones that the history books made a decision not to look at directly, subscribe and ring the bell. There are more of them. The Hollows kept their secrets well. Some men built their lives in places the law couldn't reach, and some of them knew exactly why they chose those places.